All right, we've got another guest on the pod today. I think you can only learn by speaking to very smart people, and we've got one here today. So she's a PhD student, associate instructor at what I would consider the best school in the world, Indiana University. She's studying the field that I want to discuss today. So the counseling, sport, and performance psychology world, mental health in sports, all that kind of thing. Decided I wanted to talk about it. So Katy Johnson, welcome to the pod.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I wanted to start with just a little bit of what got you interested in this field in general. So I feel like it's an area of study that's definitely risen in popularity recently. Just everything around mental health has increased in popularity. What made you want to pursue like this specific field?
Gosh, a lot goes into that question. I feel like it kind of, all of my worlds sort of collided. Obviously, I grew up as an athlete, and so sport has always been of interest to me. I was a collegiate athlete too, went through my own fair share of struggles as a collegiate athlete. And then after I graduated from undergrad, I joined Peace Corps and did some other public service positions where I was working with youth in some capacity. And I knew that I liked the service piece of it. But I also loved like trying to understand people's behavior and just getting to know people better, developing relationships. And so kind of like serendipitously ran into or like met a professor down at Georgia Southern University who then became a very close mentor of mine. And I applied to the program at Georgia Southern and really like fell in love with the field of sports psych because everything just kind of came together. And then through education and just talking with people while I was in school there, learned about the next steps of PhD and what that meant to like be a somebody in the field, and decided to pursue it to become the person that I didn't have when I was an athlete, both growing up and in college. So now I'm sort of on that trajectory to fill the role that I wish I would have had when I was going through it. So
Gotcha. Yeah, that's cool. I know like I'm a golf fan, obviously, as you may remember from high school or whatever. So like I see guys like Max Homa now, like they travel around with a sports psychologist, and there's just like sports psychology has become such a big field in college athletics, professional athletics. Anywhere you go, it feels like they are um, continuing to like rise in importance, and it's just more accepted to be like, yeah, I have my personal trainer, but I also have my mental trainer kind of thing. Like, do you see that
mm-hmm.
continuing in the future? Do you see that field continuing like and it continuing to expand like it has?
For sure. And I think that maybe it's a little bit hopeful on my end, obviously, because I'm going to be entering into the field. It's not in its infancy anymore. Thankfully, we've had enough trailblazers ahead of us that have allowed like the groundwork to be set. But I think it's still in its like maybe like toddlerhood, childhood in a sense. So it's still developing. There's a lot of different layers to sports psychology that I think a lot of people aren't aware of. So I'm going into like the licensed sports psychologist route. And so I will be able to call myself a sports psychologist, but there's other layers to it. So people can do this work and have a master's in sports psych and they strictly focus on the performance and mental skills work. And then there's the other side where it's more clinical and you're addressing more like mental health. And then there's people like me who are trained in both that will be able to kind of like be the intersection of those two things. So there's a lot of different positions out there. I think it will only continue to grow, and hopefully as we can address the stigma, there will be more openness from organizations, athletic departments, etc., to employ people that have this sort of training to support the athletes and the performers in those spaces.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like it's an interesting phenomenon in general of just like how this field came to be, because when you really think about it, you're dealing with like when you look at someone that may have mental health concerns, struggles, challenges, whatever, and it especially when they are that athlete, like you see a person that is so like physically fit, the person that's hitting the gym, the person that's they're eating clean, they're doing all the things that it takes to be a professional athlete or a college athlete or even just a high school athlete, but then they can have these struggles behind the scenes, or maybe it's even seen that they can struggle with those mental health concerns or
Mm-hmm.
challenges. Like why necessarily do you think that is from some of what originally you would think are some of the most healthy people in the world.
Hmm. Well, I always like to say athletes are human too. And we're all humans just navigating the world, and the world is crazy, and there's a lot of things that happen. And unfortunately, there are people that have these struggles and often don't know how to communicate them. Maybe there is a stigma in their family about mental health, or they aren't aware and they don't know like what it is that they're struggling with. So I think you have to bring it back to what mental health is, and it's a human experience. And I think, especially now in pro sport, and I think even increasingly in collegiate sport, because of the new dynamics of certain things that have been passed in the last couple of years, there's so much pressure behind that. There's a certain image that you have to uphold. Just holding the title of athlete, whether that's student athlete, collegiate athlete, professional athlete, it carries a lot. And so, because the eyes are on these athletes, I think it just maybe emphasizes or highlights some of those things, or maybe it highlights the desire to try to hide and make it seem like nothing's going on. And I think with some of the professional athletes that have come out recently and been more open about their struggles, it normalizes the experience, which I'm hopeful that that's how the trend continues, because it is a normal experience. I don't think that there are many people that haven't at some point in their life experienced a mental health struggle. So I think just humanizing it a little bit, like we're all humans, and even though they're maybe at like the top level of their game, it doesn't like make them immune to experiencing something like this. It's just as important for them as it is for the layperson. So yeah, I think that's how I would answer that question, is just like we're all humans, and especially the athletes, like they deserve to be treated as that regardless of the title that they hold.
Yeah, I think you hinted at it a little bit there, but I feel like I just want to say the word now. I know you focused like a lot of your studies, from what I can tell, on like perfectionism, the idea of perfectionism, how the athlete really needs to like lay into that, how they feel like they need to be perfect in today's world. I feel like there could be a multitude of reasons for that, and I think you've studied a lot of it. I'm gonna just keep it very open here. How do you think like perfectionism plays into the athlete and their mental health today?
I feel like I'll speak for myself. Like you don't get to grad school without some perfectionistic tendencies. You aren't always a high achiever without some of those tendencies. I think where the caveat of perfectionism lies, and what a lot of people don't know maybe, is that it's the ability to handle failure, the ability to handle mistakes. And so people that are highly perfectionistic or have a lot of perfectionistic tendencies that don't have the right coping strategies or do not know how to handle failure or setback is typically where a lot of that struggle happens. So I think with athletes, especially at the level that they're at, so we'll say like high performing athletes, it's probably pretty likely that those tendencies got them to where they are. But at that point, it's then becoming, okay, how do we employ some strategies to help you whenever you don't reach the goals that you set for yourself, or you have these standards, or you think that your coaches have these standards of you, the team. So it's like, how do you balance all these expectations in a healthy way? How do you handle setback in a healthy way? So the special term is like cognitive flexibility, of just being able to like take failure for what it is, learn from it, find some meaning in it, and then, you know, trust that what you've done up to that point is working, and then get right back to it. So it's really in the difference of, you can have perfectionistic tendencies and likely be like pretty adaptive and helpful in some way, and also how are you going to cope or adapt to failure when that happens, because inevitably like failure is going to happen, especially in sport. So learning how to deal with that in a healthy way is probably where I would say like the caveat to that is like, if you don't have that, you're going to struggle. If you do have some of those strategies, that struggle might not be as intense for you.
Is that something that, like, I know you're meeting with clients now, like, is that something that you are like bringing up, of just being more open to embracing failure, of yes, this perfectionism that you are cursed or blessed with, whatever you want to decide to call that, like it can be a good thing and a bad thing, it's just something you need to live with, like is that something you hear a lot?
Yeah, I mean, I even like youth clients that I work with, it's like, man, I hate when I like strike out, or I hate whenever I like don't like meet these expectations, and I'm so hard on myself, and I'm really high in self-criticism and all these things. Like it happens at the youth level too, and for a multitude of reasons. Like sometimes it's internal, sometimes that like drive to be perfect is like really caused by like what you want from yourself, but oftentimes there's like a message that you're getting from other people too. So there's a lot to manage. Like I said, like athletes are dealing with a lot regardless of what level they're at. So I would say like broadly, even if it's not perfectionism, like just allowing athletes the space to talk about like what failure is to them, and then like, okay, how do we bounce back from that? Because even in, I mean, you use the example of golf, like you have to like be able to go from hole to hole and not like carry certain things with you. So even if it's like a minor failure, a minor setback, like in a performance setting, just like it shows up in a big way, but it can also show up in those small ways. So really learning how to bounce back from those, I think, is, yeah, it's a common shared experience among athletes of all levels from what I know.
Makes sense. Yeah, I wondered also about like the role of statistics in this. So like I I think you did a little bit of research on like baseball players in general. I there's, if mental health in sports is in the toddler phase, then probably just a little bit ahead of that is like the Moneyball statistics world with baseball, and it's coming into all other
Mm-hmm.
sports as well. Like you're watching the NBA finals right now and people are only shooting twos or layups or threes because the middle area just isn't important. So just like in general, statistics
Mm-hmm.
are playing a bigger role in all sports. Do you think the inclusion of that also just a little bit messes with like young athletes today? I know when I was playing golf, when I was playing tennis, whatever, like it just never really was a consideration to me of like, oh, today my first serve percentage was 72%, but last week it was 80. Like that never came into play, but I feel like it is coming into play now. Is that, do you see that as like a detriment
Mm-hmm.
to mental health, a positive, net positive? Like how does the statistics play into all of this?
Oh gosh. So the study that I was a part of that you're referring to was specifically like in baseball and softball. It's the only sport that has the term like perfect game. And so the perspective of that specific study was like, okay, so if you're going up to bat and like your stats are just posted on the scoreboard and you see that every single time, how does that influence you? And I mean, you have your performing arts side of things too. So like gymnastics, dance, like where you're trying to get a almost perfect score, if not a perfect score, and what pressure that carries. And so I think if I'm thinking about statistics, like even from an athletic standpoint, like as an athlete, I don't know if I thought about it much either, but it seems to be like a focus of a lot of athletes now. So my answer to this question is probably it depends, which is the most frustrating answer that I've heard in grad school. But because
You're true.
sports
You're a
psych
grad
and
student
because
if you're
mental
saying it
health,
depends.
oh
You're
my gosh, it's like, but if you think about it, like everything's based on the individual. Like there could be some individuals that like don't care at all about stats, and there are some individuals that are checking their stats after every performance. So I think like from my perspective, it definitely becomes about the individual, and it's like, is this external factor influencing you? And if it is, what is it about stats that's like so important to you? Like what meaning does this carry for you? How do you think it influences your performance? And again, like helping them deal with that. But there might be some people that are like, I don't care what my stats say up on the board. Like I'm feeling good today, and like how I played yesterday doesn't matter, or et cetera, et cetera. So definitely individualized, definitely more of an it depends. So frustrating, but that's probably how I would say stats influence. Also, just like as any external factor, to some people it might be a big deal, and to others it might not.
That's fair. I'll move into another
Yeah.
external factor then that I feel like definitely is weighing on a lot of our generation, and we haven't brought it up yet, and we're what 15 minutes in or whatever. Social media, like
Mm-hmm.
the rise of social media and balancing that of I don't it just with young athletes today, even with us today. I feel like we grew up in a generation that we were like we can see the benefits of social media, but we also somewhat aware to like this can also do like bad things to our mental health. And we kind of have that awareness of
Hmm.
the balance. I don't necessarily know if younger generations of ours necessarily had that benefit because they don't necessarily remember a world without social media and the technology playing in the role.
Hmm.
How do you think like social media's role has come in to affect mental health for athletes today?
Hmm. Actually, there was a previous doc student at IU who just graduated who did a study looking at NIL athletes, like high, those like people that are like really well known, have a lot of followers, and the influence of social media on them, and found a lot of like negative effects just from like the athlete's perspective of what that means whenever you play a bad game, and the people that are in your comments, your DMs, like all the things that they're saying, what that requires of mental preparation. So maybe that means that you're not on social media before and after a performance, or your social media habits are strictly limited to X, or whatever that is. And so I think from my perspective, there's a lot of management that needs to happen. But we see this even in like non-athlete populations, like the influence of social media is not positive. It's mostly negative, especially like in the younger generations that are growing up with that and are so connected to it. Um, there's also like I think there's a new focus for a lot of young recruits to use social media, whether that's like posting videos and trying to get like tag coaches and trying to get seen on social media in that way. And then the flip side of that is coaches are looking at athletes' social media, and maybe that like is dependent on whether they get an offer or not. And so I think there's a lot of interplaying factors with social media that not a lot of people realize. But I think for those athletes that are, in the spotlight, it becomes even more of a detriment, just because they're having to manage it a lot more, and their lives are plastered all over their social media. So um, broadly, I would perceive it as a negative thing. Just because it does highlight some of it highlights flaws. It allows people to hide behind screens and say things that they wouldn't otherwise say. And like kids not knowing that balance, like you said, it's really challenging. So I don't foresee it being a super positive thing, but I do think that um, once we can learn more management strategies to find maybe that healthy balance, could be, not entirely negative, but I don't know if I see that in the near future.
Yeah, is it something you foresee as just like I think it's not going to go away. Or I don't think we're going to get it to a world, 5 years from now where it's just like, wow, remember when we used to be on Twitter and Instagram and all that kind of stuff before? We never do that anymore. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's just going to become more and more. So is that something that like,
Mm-hmm.
as you're learning, as you're preparing to go into your career, like, are you just accepting like this is something that I need to be prepared for when I have people come to me with these kind of issues?
For sure. I think it's also a difference between old school, new school type mindset. Like it would be really easy for me to say, oh, like social media, like when I grew up, it wasn't like that big of a deal, and sort of like embrace that belief system, but that's not the reality of the clients that I'm working with. And so I think in order to better understand the athletes that I'm working with, their experiences, I have to be aware of that, and be open to whatever those perspectives are. And so I'm really trying to offer a space that allows the athletes to like fully express and open up about what they're going through. And if social media is a big part of that, then I feel like it's my responsibility to know the ins and outs. So because it's not going away, I think you have to like stay up with the times. And in my position, it's not so much of like, it might not mean that much to me, but it probably means a lot to somebody else. And so yeah, allowing my own biases and realities to not get in the way of the people that I'm helping. It'd be my perspective, at least as a professional.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Um, yeah, we'll have the increase of like sports psychologists on teams, etc., for individuals, etc. I also feel like probably some of this now will fall on like coaches or mentors of these athletes in a way that it hasn't in the past. I didn't, my little league coach wasn't also talking about my mental health with me kind of thing. I had the best little league coach in
Mm-hmm.
the world, I thought, but that was never a part of like how this was going. But do you see this like becoming a thing that, coaches also need to be, maybe they're in the interview process and they're also being asked about how they deal with students or student athletes that are struggling with mental health?
I hate to use the example of Ohio State in a call where we're, some diehard IU people, but I think Urban Meyer came out. I think that's his name. I think he came out not too long ago about. I hope I'm talking about the right person because sometimes like the big names get all mixed up in my head, but I'm pretty sure he came out and talked about his mental health struggles. And because of that, one of his athletes came out and spoke to how his coach being open about his own mental health allowed him to be open about his mental health. And that's in a sport that's extremely stigmatized and predominantly lies in the masculine, like gender norms and things like that. And so I think, especially in those spaces, it becomes really important. And then speaking to like your example in Little League, like if you do have a coach that's at least willing to talk about it, and maybe they don't speak to their experiences, and maybe they're not vulnerable themselves, but just like saying, like checking in on athletes or being aware of the language, I think becomes really important because that just means that the athlete feels comfortable. So I do think it's important that the coaches at least have the knowledge and the language. Is it their responsibility solely to carry that and to learn that? I don't know if that's realistic. Does seem more of like a systems organizational thing where if we want the coaches to be successful, then we have to give them the resources to be successful. So I think there is some stigma around mental health, and I think coaches have to be willing to learn that. And I also think that there is like an organizational way to do that to allow coaches to thrive too, because coaches' mental health is also super important. So how are we supporting coaches so that their athletes are also supported? How can we just make it a shared language so that it's normal to talk about and the stigma is not there? And I think we see that in some cases. More coaches have come out and talked about maybe they've worked with a sports psychologist or maybe they're willing to talk to their athletes about it, versus some coaches who still see mental health as something that's a detriment, and athletes are scared to go to their coaches because they're fearful of getting kicked off the team or losing playing time or whatever the reason is. So I think the responsibility probably is more broad, maybe on everybody, but I also think that they have to be open to having those conversations and being willing to learn that language too.
This answer can be no, and we can just move on. But I just wondered, have you worked with any coaches? Does that come up in your studies or your
Never will
meeting?
not. I have colleagues who are very interested in coaches' mental health. I have colleagues who are really interested in like cultural humility in coaches and how they are showing up for their athletes. So there's a lot of research in that space for sure. I think me personally, I have interest in coaches because I'm close to a lot of coaches and I see all of the stress that they're carrying. But typically sports psychologists are hired in organizations to work with the athletes, and there's a very, very like thin line of working with the athletes as clients and then working with coaches, and then the conflict of interest there. So it's hard and how like it's set up right now. But I do think that just from working with teams and interacting with coaches, like the more that sports psychologists and other support staff can communicate with coaches and with each other, the better the system functions, right? Like if we're all using the same language, and if the athlete says something to the athletic trainer and then the athletic trainer comes to the sports psych person, or if the athletic trainer and the coach are talking but they're using the same language that the sports psych used in a session with the team, it just becomes a lot more like functional, I guess. So I think everybody's interconnected, and I think coaches for sure deserve to utilize the resources of sports psych too, because they're going through very similar experiences, and while their performance looks different, they're also carrying a lot of stress, and just like athletes, they're humans too, so they're going to go through their own struggles. So I think everybody can benefit. It just depends on the function of the system, but I think a lot of the shared language becomes really important with that.
Yeah, that alone is something that I had never really thought about until you brought it up, of just like the the pressures of sport are not going to only fall on the people that are out there on the field or the court playing it, it's also going to be the people that are leading it. So yeah, that's intriguing. Now I kind of want to look up stuff
Mm-hmm.
about that, because I focused mostly on
Mm-hmm.
athletes here, but now I'm like, I always loved the, coaching, and that kind of thing always intrigues me. So now I'm gonna have to do some research on that. Anyways, though,
Yeah.
I feel like all of this that we've talked about, it kind of boils up to, like the darker side of mental health challenges, and that's suicide in athletes. I feel like I want to touch briefly on this. So there was a report very beginning of April this year that showed that suicide rates have doubled in the last 20 years among U.S. college athletes. There, could be lots of reasons for this. There's the pressures of school. There's internal and external performance expectations, time demands. The players get injured. They're more fatigued. All of these things can combine into one thing. I'm sure it's not just one thing. It's all of the stuff that we've talked about before. So this is a big question here, I guess, but like, what do you think is at the core of this? Do you think there's being steps taken to improve this? Just like, I guess just in general, I'll leave it open to you.
Yeah, it's a challenging topic to talk about, and it deserves to be talked about. I think, especially in the last couple of years, it's become something that I've taken upon myself to learn more about, because I think it's something really easy to say. It's out of sight, out of mind, right? Like, I'm not struggling with this, so I don't need to pay attention to it. But I've realized, and the numbers show it, that it is a problem. There are steps being taken. I think you can see it in like legislation, and even the NCAA in 2019 employing like all universities, all NCAA affiliated universities have to have a mental health professional on staff for athletics specifically. But there's still more to be done. And I think stigma lies at the heart of a lot of it too. Multicultural experiences, so people from different backgrounds not having, maybe they grew up in a situation where it wasn't okay to talk about mental health, or the masculine, like for men, like it's just not normal to talk about their experiences. Like you said, there's so many interplaying factors. It is a very individualized experience, and so I think, um, I would say empowering athletes is becomes really important. Like reminding them that they're not alone, reminding them that there are services, checking in on them, knowing what the signs are. Um, I guess like being educated about it, spreading knowledge about it. I've become pretty close with an organization called Helinski's Hope, and the parents, of a collegiate athlete who died by suicide started the organization in honor of him, and they go around and they give what they call the Tyler Talk. Tyler Hilinski was his name, and they give the Tyler Talk to different high schools and universities across the U.S. And that's to promote awareness, but then they also tried to fund mental health programming for colleges and high schools to have, so that there are people in place, or there are systems in place for the athletes or the individuals that struggle with this. And it is a mental health thing. So a lot of it goes unnoticed, a lot of it goes hidden. But I think like spreading awareness, knowing what the resources are, knowing who you can go to, having the people, having a support system becomes really important. And also, all of those would be like protective factors of just like, these are the things that I know, are going to help me whenever I start to feel this way. Um, yeah, it's hard, because I think this is one of the most individualized experiences, where it really depends on the person, and their own experiences around mental health. And I think as professionals, it just becomes really important to keep that in mind, especially when we think about all that athletes are carrying and all of the pressures that they have, and knowing just to show up. I remind myself all the time, like, just show up and remind people that you're there. Um, because at the end of the day, like, at least like having somebody in your corner, or like knowing somebody's there, I think can make the difference. So that's my perspective on it. I know there's a lot more to be said about it, but I think just like really paying attention to the organizations that are doing the work, and continuing to try to decrease the stigma, especially in, like across cultures, will become really important moving forward.
Yeah, I love that you said show up, because that's always been like something that I try to bring in, relationships, friendships, being with my family, whatever, of just like, there's something about whether you're 100 years old or 7 years old, if you're able to look up and be like, oh, that person's in my corner. They've got my
Mhm.
back. It's just, I don't know. It's very cool. I think it's something that it's small, but goes a very long way. So,
Mhm.
okay, wanted to touch on that. I also wanted to just
Mhm.
go kind of transition, tough to transition from that topic, anyways. But
Yeah. Yeah.
um, where do you see it? What's your dream career out of this? I guess, like, do you want to be working for the Chicago Cubs and be a sports psychologist on there? Where do you see this going?
Oh gosh, I'm really putting it out there. So like the manifestation is real.
Yeah.
I've still got a while. So
Yes.
I'm going into my second year of PhD, which means I still have about 4 years to go until I'll come out licensed. So I would say, gosh, it's hard to say what the field's going to be at that point.
Yeah.
It'll probably change, but I think pro sport would be really cool. I will say that I like the work life flow. We'll say work life rhythm because I don't know if balance is ever achievable. But I
Yep.
think I would love to have a position where like I can like have my life outside of it because sport can be pretty grueling, and even as a sports psychologist, you're doing the traveling and all of that stuff. So I feel like dream job at this point would be either pro sport or USOPC, working like with Olympic athletes. But I think there's
Hmm.
something to be said about the youth. I guess like before they get to college, before they go pro, before they, all of these things, they can have some of these skills. So I have a soft spot in my heart for those individuals too. So I don't know. The answer is I don't know, but I can. There's a lot of different options. I'm hopeful that by the time I graduate, those options will still be there. Um, Something that allows me to do what I love and also do what I love outside of my professional life too. Ideally, is how I'm going to answer that. Final answer.
Final answer. Yeah, that makes sense. I feel it's the work life flow, as you called it, because like your psychology, your mental health is important too going through it. So like,
Hmm.
if you're not at your best, it's the same reason I take a lunch break every day, even when I work from home. Just like, I sometimes you need to disconnect. It's better for your own
Exactly.
mentals, kind of thing.
Yes. Yes. And especially in this profession, like we do sit across from people who are going through a lot of hard stuff. And so just knowing how to take care of ourselves and prioritize that becomes really important because you can only give so much. And if you're not filling yourself back up, then it's you and your clients that are suffering. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, that makes sense. So you said you have 4 more years of schooling. You said.
Yeah. So technically PhD is usually like a 5 year process, 5 to 6 year process. But because it's a PhD in counseling psych, there's a lot more requirements. So we have research, we have clinical, and we have like our course requirements. And then there's a year of internship afterwards. So to get all of that in, even in 5 or 6 years, is quite a bit. But that's just like the APA accreditation. Like that's the process of it. So yeah, I'll be in Bloomington for the next 3 years.
Well, it's a great place to be.
Sure.
Um, all right, Katie, thank you for joining. That's all I had for you. So really appreciate you coming on, talking about mental health and
Yeah.
sports. Not always easy,
Yeah.
but really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.